Frank sat on a faded plastic chair like a king without a crown. The sun burned the roof of Kingsley Close and the TikTok videos burned his eyes. He watched men on the screen count money, smile, and walk into cars that looked like palaces. He watched women with soft voices tell him, "You can be rich quick. Work smart." Frank liked the sound of the words more than the work. He liked the dream of being famous more than the sweat that comes with building. His belly was round from too many suya nights. His trousers were soft at the knee from long hours of doing nothing. People in the compound called him many names. Children called him Big Talk. Old men shook their heads and said, "That one will chop and clean mouth." But in his head Frank heard drums of praise and saw himself on a shiny poster that read, "Frank, CO." Linda walked past him, a needle tucked like a small sword in her hand, and the sound of the sewing machine was a song for their small house. She hummed and her hands moved quick and steady. She counted money into small envelopes, each marked for bread, light, school, dreams she kept to herself. Linda knew the weight of money. She had carried it for years like a basket on a long journey. She loved Frank. Love kept her forgiving, kept her making pots of soft soup when he came home tired from nothing. But love also had limits. Her eyes had learned the language of worry. She spoke when necessary and shut her mouth when the words would make him angry. "Do not start what you cannot finish," she told him more than once. Frank laughed and said, "My breakthrough is close. God will disgrace my enemies." The words were light like feathers. Linda held the feathers and felt how hollow they were. Junior, 6 years old, carried stones across the compound like a prince carrying the world. He had his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw. Sometimes he stood by the poster Frank made with crayons and saw kings and boats and tall buildings he could not name. At night he would sleep with his toys, one little toy truck with wheels missing, and dream of driving into the big city to bring food for his mother. Junior knew things by the way the elders spoke. He learned the names of people by the way they treated his family. When neighbors laughed at Frank, Junior's chest hurt. But when they clapped for Frank, Junior's chest swelled like a drum. Children learn fast. He learned praise first, but he was learning silence too, how to look away when a father was broken. Junior loved Linda's cooking and her stories of old days when the compound was small and the market had only one drum to call everyone. She told him about the river spirit that watches the compound, and the woman who kept the Isuzu box. Linda used stories like stones to make a small path for Junior to walk on. "Trust is a river," she told him once. "You must not throw stones that will make it muddy." Junior touched the needle sometimes, but not like his mother. He would watch Frank with the same soft hope that a child saves for a bird. Children keep hope like a seed. It can grow into something tough or be eaten by ants. Junior's small hands would one day learn how to build or how to destroy. For now, they only learned to copy what they saw. Kingsley Close was more than a place. It breathed like a big sleeping animal, and every sound was its lungs. Widows bought cola at the corner, boys ran between houses to fetch water, and old men sat under the neem tree to remember names and give proverbs. The compound had its own rules. You did not take a neighbor's washing to hang it, you did not mock the woman who sold hot Gary, and you never broke the Isuzu box. These rules were not on paper. They lived inside people. They lived in the stories mothers told and in the sharp eyes of the elders. The compound was like a family with many mouths. When one mouth eats too much, the others notice. When one mouth refuses to eat, the family worries. At Sunday meetings, people spoke in the old way, soft, full of warnings. The compound had kept people for years. It had kept secrets and also misdeeds. When someone tried to rise too fast, others watched with a wary eye. But the compound could also lift a fallen hand. They gave a little sugar, a little borrowed money, a plate when hunger knocked. Trust was a currency not written down. Many had learned how to save, how to add small coins until they made a lump large enough to buy a new freezer or send a child to school. This thrift made wives build businesses and gave the compound power. The Isuzu was the heart that pumped money and hope. The heart could be strong, But hearts break when they are cheated. Mama Jacob and Mrs. Okoro were sisters of the compound, though not by blood. They had the hands of women who had sewn lives together stitch by stitch. They met every Thursday under the neem tree with an old tin box. They called it our small safe. Their voices were low, a careful hush, like prayers. Mama Jacob had just counted a little mountain of money, 120,000 naira, enough for a freezer to start a small shop. Her eyes shone. Mrs. Okoro planned to use her share to start a little cloth business. They smiled and touched the coins like they were young again. These small victories were kept secret so that the wind would not steal them. They knew how to make money slow, like a cow walking to market. Slow meant strong. Frank heard fragments of their talk from his chair, and something cold moved in his chest. It was not hunger. It was a hunger for respect. He wanted the sound their neighbors made when they spoke of new businesses. He wanted the small shy bow their husbands gave them when they became boss. The idea of thrift lit a fire in him, but a strange fire. He would not take the slow road of saving. He wanted to cut the road with a knife, to make money obey him. He dreamed of a poster with his name and a crowd chanting his praises. Behind his eyes, the compound folded itself into a stage, and he became the main actor. The truth was that Frank did not love work. He loved the picture of reward without the labor. That hunger would shape what he did next. That night, Frank drew with Junior's crayons. The poster looked like a child's prayer, big letters, misspelled words, and a promise that sang too loudly. Secure your future today. Double your returns in 6 months. No stress, it said, in shaky letters. He stuck the poster on the notice board where people put lost keys and second-hand shoes. It was the beginning of something small that would become a storm. He practiced the words he would say. He imagined women handing him money with a smile. He imagined men bowing when they heard his name. He practiced his CEO face in the mirror. His forehead tightened like a drum. Linda watched and said nothing. She knew the smell of lies when they began. She tied her cloth tight at the waist and pretended to sew. When Frank knocked on doors, his voice was smooth like sugar. He told stories about doubling money. He spoke of trust and branding, and other big words he heard on the videos. People asked questions. He answered some, lied on others, and smiled through all of them. 8 neighbors and 3 men from outside the compound believed him enough to hand him their savings. Then neighbors came together like a little river and poured their coins into Frank's hands. He counted the money once, twice, and then again. His heart beat loud as a drum in the quiet house. Linda watched him tuck the money under a mat. She told him to keep it safe. He promised. The promise sat like a small stone between them. For the first time he felt he had more than an idea. He felt like a man others trusted. The feeling tasted like salt and honey, and it changed him. By the second week, people formed a line on Frank's doorstep every Sunday. They handed their envelopes to him with the ritual of trust. He sat behind a small wooden table and wrote names on scrap paper and tore bread-sized pieces to serve as receipts. The papers looked like money, but they were only dreams written in pencil. He issued the receipts with a flourish, imagining himself wearing sunglasses in the sun and magazines calling him financial genius. The neighbors called him CEO, and the name stuck like gum. Children ran after him like moths around a lamp. He liked the light they gave him. Linda stitched in the corner and said nothing. Words were no longer enough. The small box beneath the mat grew heavier. Frank began to feel the powers of being a person people looked up to. He spoke loudly in the market and nodded when people brought stories. He bought a cheap watch and a pair of sneakers from a man who sold originals from a basket. He bought a polo shirt with CEO ironed on it. The clothes felt tight at first, like a borrowed life. He would walk past Mama Bai's grill and throw extra coins to the Okada riders, not because he had, but to look like someone who had plenty. The compound watched him spend easily, and gossip moved like a fast breeze. Some were impressed, others kept their hands in their pockets. Pride is a slow fire. It heats from small acts and can burn down houses. The first night he spent money on suya. The meat burned sweet, and he felt a kind of warm pride he had never known. He ate and laughed and told people stories of coming richness. In the morning, the small box under the mat was lighter. He promised himself he would return the money, that he was just borrowing for a short time. Borrowing, in his mouth, became a magic word that made wrong become right. The community had given him a small trust, and he turned it into his mirror. Uncle Boda came to him like thunder with a child on his lap. His daughter was sick, and the school wanted fees that could not wait. He needed his 50,000 naira, and he needed it now. He did not come to plead as a beggar. He came with the authority of a man whose bread depended on a swift hand. Frank's heart beat like the drums at the market when a fight begins. He made a small joke and smiled, but the joke tasted like ash. Bank balancing, he said, a word he had borrowed from a video. The excuse did not sound right to old ears. Uncle Boda left with a slow sorrow in his shoulders. Rumors began to rise. Mrs. Okoro watched the way Frank's shoes shone and the way he refused to hand over the cash. She told Mama Jacob, and a whisper made its way from house to house. Fear sat in Frank's belly, a heavy box of stones. He had spent pieces of the pot of trust. The small coins he had eaten now seemed to scream. He slowed his steps and thought about his choices. But the river of greed had already started. The next week a video flashed across his phone, a voice promising to turn 100,000 into more within days. The voice was smooth and called itself expert. Frank listened as if to a drum he would dance to. The idea put a new color into his eyes. He told himself he could return the money and have more to spare. He would not be humble. He would be a man who made a river run the other way. Frank watched the video late at night when the house was quiet and the sewing machine hummed like a lullaby in the other room. Turn 100,000 Nigerian nairas into 1.2 million Nigerian nairas in 2 weeks, the man on the screen said. The voice was clothed in confidence. He showed numbers like a magician shows coins. The offer smelled like the suya that had once made Frank proud. He stayed awake and thought of tents of money, of being called boss in the market, of Junior looking up with eyes that said, "Papa, you have done it." The money under the mat seemed to whisper too, asking to be used for greatness. Frank took the money in the night, all of it, and he sent it to the man the screen called expert. He closed his eyes and tasted victory. But rivers that look wide at the top can be narrow at the bottom. The expert disappeared like smoke. Messages went unread. Numbers that once glowed like stars became blank. Frank waited and waited. His palms sweated. He imagined the people lined outside his door the way vultures imagine a fallen goat. He saw Linda's face and her quiet disappointment. He remembered the small stone of promise between them and felt it like a weight. The next morning the compound woke with a new kind of silence. This silence has teeth. People began to ask for their money. Voices that had once praised him now looked like knives. The compound's trust trembled like a leaf in a strong wind. Mama Jacob came first. Her face was like a dusk that had lost its last light. She had used the money for the freezer and needed more to pay the man who had fixed its door. She spoke gently at first, like one speaks to a child. "Frank, I need my money," she said. The voice that called Frank CEO only weeks before was now thin. Frank gave her small promises and small lies. He moved around the questions like someone walking on broken glass. He had nothing to give. Then came others. Mr. Johnson, the landlord, gathered people in an emergency meeting. His voice carried a law that had nothing to do with the police. Trust was not just an agreement. It was the very fabric of how the compound fed itself. When trust is torn, people feel hungry and cold. Mrs. Okoro walked the compound like a woman carrying a heavy pot. Her mouth said things that cut, and she shook her head like an elder who had been betrayed. "He is eating our money," she told anyone who would listen. Chido, one of the outside contributors, was furious, and he came with proof in his hand. Names that did not match, receipts that were false. He accused Frank of making ghost contributors and told the story of how Frank had inflated totals to look important. The news moved fast. Children stopped playing near Frank's door. He felt the eyes of the compound on him like the night that watches a thief. Panic grew where pride had lived. For the first time in his life, Frank understood shame. Mr. Johnson gave him an ultimatum: repay 300,000 naira in 48 hours or face the police. The compound watched as if they were waiting for a storm to break. Frank's palms were empty. He had spent his last pride on shoes that would not pay a single naira back. Panic made his thoughts small and sharp. He begged, he promised, and he told stories that were only air. Linda stood at the edge of the meeting like a woman standing on a cliff, and tears ran down her face. She had told him not to start what he could not finish. Now the words became a triangle in her chest. She called her elder brother, Mr. Samuel. His name alone was like a hammer. Samuel came like a man who knows how to fix things by force when talk does not work. When Samuel arrived, the compound breathed a different sound. He shook his head and his mouth spoke like an old law. He paid 150,000 naira to calm the people and make the noise stop. He made Frank sign a paper that said he must repay the rest within 3 months. The paper was like a rope around Frank's neck. The police did not come that day, but the weight remained. Frank had escaped prison but not shame. Linda told him quietly, "Respect comes from hard work, not shortcuts." Frank said, "God will provide," because the old words were comfortable to his tongue. They did not help the hole in the ground he had dug for himself. The compound had forgiven him only because a stern brother paid the price. His name was still a shadow on the wall. Samuel found Frank a small job at Mama Bai's grill stand. He would wear a faded apron and count coins for people who came in wanting meat. The apron felt like truth. It touched his skin and taught him how slow a life could be. He learned to give change honestly and to say sorry without adding a smile. Every coin he gave back to a customer was like a small stitch on the ragged place in his heart. The neighbors laughed sometimes, and children called him CO Chop and Clean Mouth. The words cut like small knives, but the cuts healed slowly. He had time to think in the heat of the grill smoke. Heat will change what meat tastes like. It also changed Frank. Linda watched him work and cried quietly at night. She did not mock him. She had been the voice of caution and had been ignored. Now she had to choose between anger and mercy. Mercy for her was not a soft thing. It was a strong, heavy tool. She could have left him. Many women would. But she stayed because a child needed both parents, and because she had loved him when he had only big words and no work. She told her brother that Frank must work hard and learn to stand tall on his own feet. Samuel grunted and said nothing. He liked the sound of the apron when Frank came home, honest and smelling of smoke. When the night came, the river spoke in small round sounds against the stones. Old women said river spirits watch over money given in trust. They call the spirit Nne Akwu, mother of the safe. She likes truth and hates false names. A small child can hear the river when the world is quiet, or a guilty man can hear it when sleep leaves his bones. Frank began to have dreams of the river. In his dreams, a tall woman in cloth the color of moonlight sat by the water and asked him to return what did not belong to him. He woke with the taste of cola in his mouth and the weight of a coin on his tongue. The dreams felt like judgment, but also like a chance for healing. He began to believe that the ground would not always be hard under his feet if he learned to bend. One night he walked to the river and took off his shoes. The water licked his toes like a cold hand. He told the river everything: his promises, his lies, his fear. He felt small and the river felt large. The voice of the river was not angry. It was patient. The woman in his dream told him, "Work, and you will smell good." The words were simple. Work will change the way people see you. Work will change your scent from one of talk to one of action. Frank left the river with his heart turned like a calabash. He decided to try. But decision is not a path. It is only a small stone thrown into a long road. Linda's hands worked like a drum that would not stop. She had joined her small savings with Samuel's help and began to open a tiny stall where she sewed and sold cloth. Her work was honest, and her customers came because her stitch was true. She had little time for the gossip and less for forgiveness that had not earned its way. Her heart had been broken and mended in the same night until the seam grew strong. She sometimes spoke to Frank in the early mornings when he came home tired from the grill. Her voice had no anger. It was a river that had been through the rocks. "You must pay back what you took," she would say. Frank nodded and said, "I will," and then left with smoke on his clothes and a heavy shame in his chest. There were days Linda hated him. She would take the boy Junior to the market and watch how others looked at them. She wanted her son to learn that dignity comes from the sweat of your hands and the honesty of your heart. She taught Junior how to fold cloth carefully and how to say, "Thank you," when someone gave him a small coin. Linda would tell him stories of women who rose from nothing by work and perseverance. The stories were small fires that warmed their small house. Frank listened to these stories, and sometimes he cried in the heat of the grill smoke, but tears alone do not stitch a new life. Mama Jacob came to the stall one afternoon carrying a basket of yams wrapped in brown paper. She did not look at Frank with anger. Her face had deep lines from a life of waking early and staying up late. She sat on a low stool and told Linda an old song about the shape of shame. "When laziness marries greed," she sang softly, "their first child is shame." The song was not meant to hurt Frank. It was meant to teach. Mama Jacob told the story of a man who tried to smoke gold from the river and learned only how to smoke his hands. She said the Isusu gives people more than money. It gives them honor and a place in the market songs. When honor goes, the songs turn into whispers. Frank listened to the songs and felt like he was being cut by a careful knife. He wanted to respond with big promises again, but the words stuck in his throat. The songs had measurements he could not measure with coins. He began to think of ways to repay, but the debt felt like a house built of stones he could not lift. The days of grave work at the grill made his hands rough, and the roughness made him think differently. Some mornings he woke before the sun and carried water to the stalls like a small man trying to make a new beginning. He began to say sorry without adding a little lie to soften it. He gave a small piece of his earnings to Mama Jacob to help fix the freezer door. It was small, but it was a piece of truth. One rainy afternoon, Frank found an old box at the back of Mama Bai's grill stand. The box had receipts and faded papers. He studied them and saw patterns of how the compound saved. The receipts were honest and simple. They were not fancy, but they had life. He began to keep a small book of his own, not to make fake receipts now, but to learn how to count properly. He practiced adding numbers like a boy learning to walk. He made small mistakes and learned to say them aloud so they would not haunt him later. The act of counting slowly taught him patience. He realized trust was not magic. It was daily small things done right. The discovery felt like the first time a child learns to plant and watches the seed break. With that small change, he started giving accurate change at the grill and writing real receipts. He taught himself to be on time. He learned to call customers politely and to fix mistakes without hiding them. The neighbors noticed something different. Their eyes were still suspicious, but some softened. Mama Jacob accepted the little coins he gave to help with her freezer. Uncle Boda smiled when Frank handed him his small change correctly. Linda watched and permitted a small smile. Small things can turn a river. They do not turn it quickly, but over time the current moves. Work stitches seems people thought could not be sewed again. Junior watched his father quietly. He began to take lessons from the small things. He would follow Frank to the grill and carry plates, bending his small hands to learn how to set them right. He learned to be patient when customers were slow and how to make the smallest of smiles when people were rude. Linda taught him how to sew small patches and how to keep a tiny notebook of coins. The boy learned that belonging to a compound meant keeping promises, not only keeping names. One day, when a bully called Frank "Zio Chop" and "Clean Mouth," Junior stood and said, "My father works." The word was small, but it sounded like a drum. The compound fell silent and then clapped. Pride can be rebuilt by a child who learns truth early. Junior also learned humility from watching his father's hands. He learned that mistakes are heavy but can be carried when you ask for help. He would find his father kneeling by the river, counting coins slowly in the moonlight, and then sit quietly beside him. One night Frank told Junior the whole story, with all the parts that were shameful. Junior asked, "Papa, why did you do it?" Frank looked into his son's eyes and said, "I was afraid to work. I wanted respect without the steps." Junior shook his head. "Work builds respect," the boy said. The child had learned the lesson before the man. Months passed and the compound slowly patched itself. But a new wind came. A slick man with a glossy phone and a suit that looked like it had been borrowed came to the market. He smiled like one who had practiced 1,000 smiles. He spoke softly and told new stories about quick wins. Many people do not forget the taste of easy money, and a few ears are always ready to listen. He promised a plan that sounded new and bigger than Frank's old lies. He spoke of the city and of doors that opened only when you had his name. Some people were tempted. Old hunger is a quick friend. Frank watched the man from a distance. His heart jumped back to the old wildness. He felt the old tired pride whisper to him. But this time he did not run. He spoke with Linda and with Samuel and with Mama Jacob. They listened and they told him things he needed to hear. Samuel said, "Do not sell your people a dream that will steal their bread." Linda folded cloth and said, "We will build slow, and the slow road will last longer." The man with the glossy phone left with some who liked the sound of new words. But the compound had learned to be wary. They had learned to smell the difference between a promise and a plan. One day a man named Cheeto returned. He was the one who had first pointed out Frank's false receipts. But now Cheeto came with a new look in his eyes. His clothes were not as sharp as before, and his voice had less anger. He told Frank something strange. "I did not want to break you before," Cheeto said. "I wanted to wake you." The words were like a small knife. Frank could not tell if the man was kind or cruel. Cheeto showed Frank a ledger he had kept for himself. "There is a man in the city who takes money from quick dreamers and throws it away," he said. "He will keep coming if we do not stop him." The man's face looked tired and he spoke like someone who had seen too many burned hands. Cheeto's confession was a turning point. It did not make Frank a hero, but it made him wake to a new kind of fight. He began to see himself not only as a man who must fix his mistakes, but as a man who must help guard others from the same snake oil. He began to learn how to ask questions to strangers and to test things before trusting them. The compound listened when he spoke now because his words were tied to work and memory rather than only dream. He also learned that not all enemies wear dark clothes. Some wear smiles. Frank found small honest jobs beyond the grill. He fixed lost things, carried water for a small fee, and helped people move from one room to another. He taught himself how to make a crude table and learned how to polish it until the wood shone. He sold the table and used the money to buy a box of good seeds for Mama Jacob's little garden. He repaired the old Isuzu box and carved a new lock for it. Each small task was like a word of apology. He said them with his hands and not only with his mouth. The compound began to nod when he walked by. Respect returned in small footfalls. Work changed his walk. It made his shoulders broader and his mouth quieter. The small coins he now collected were honest. He counted them in the evening and felt a different kind of pride. It was not the loud pride of a man with new shoes, but a quiet kind that warmed like cloth by a fire. Linda began to trust more and watch less. She saw a man make slow, steady choices. Samuel still kept an eye on him, but the look was less hard. The real test would be what he did when the man with the glossy phone reappeared. One hot market day, the glossy man came back. He had new words and new tricks. He laughed easily and said that the compound had missed a huge chance. Some people listened with hungry ears. Frank stepped forward, not with a loud voice, but with a small plan. He asked the glossy man for records and for time. He asked for witnesses and for references. He asked for the red rule everyone in the compound had come to live by. No quick offer without proof of a track record. The glossy man began to frown and walk faster. The compound watched and chanted in small voices, the old truths they had learned again like heartbeats. That day the glossy man left without taking their money. He did not like the slow test people gave. The compound had become a shield, and Frank had helped build that shield with his honest work. Men in suits who sell fast promises do not like slow community. They like hurried pockets. The compound had found strength in the small acts of truth Frank and Linda had chosen. The market returned to its usual song. Children played and sang by the old water tap. The Isuzu box sat under the neem tree, quiet and full again. Months later a man came from the city with the same style, but a face now brittle with rage. He had lost money to people who refused his tricks, and he wanted to break someone to regain his pride. He found one place where a small business ran by humble hands made food for many. He thought he could scare them with threats and empty words. But this man had not counted on the compound. Frank stood with the elders and Samuel, and a small crowd gathered like a shield. They asked him to show proof of his scheme. He could not. They told him that the law of the compound was that any plan that touches the people must stand before the elders. The man laughed and called them fools. He threatened, but the compound was steady. Men like Mr. Johnson, who had once called Frank a thief, now stood with him. The man with the city tricks found he had no place to throw his stones. That day a great lesson was learned. Shame can be repaired by steady work and a whole community choosing to protect itself. The trickster left muttering, and his phone was quietly copied by Mr. Johnson to show by the elders as an example of cunning. The compound placed his glossy card on a wooden board with the words, "Watch this face, but do not give him bread." When the rainy season came, the compound had small bright things to celebrate. Mama Jacob's freezer now hummed with fish and ice. Linda sold cloth and small dresses and used the earnings to buy school books for Junior. The Isuzu box held a small pile of coins, and a few new faces learned the old rules. Frank had saved slowly, and he had paid back a part of what Samuel had extended. He still owed money, but the string around his neck felt lighter. The children sang songs about how the compound had saved itself from fast money. The song did not name Frank's name in shame. Instead it told how a man found the sweat of his hands and learned a new way. Frank's life was not perfect. He still woke some nights and felt the tug of fast promises that glittered like small fish in a bowl. But he now had nets made of work and friends who would pull him back when he reached for the glass. He had learned that a good name is built like a house, stone on stone, not by shouting. Linda and Junior laughed more. Samuel smiled less often, but there was softness when he looked at them. The compound had become a place where mistakes were not finished stories, but ways to teach new beginnings. At the August meeting, the compound made a big fire and drummed long into the night. They told the story of the man who had eaten the Isuzu money. They did not shout only to shame him. They sang his road as a warning and a lesson. Frank stood up and told the compound the truth in his own small voice. He spoke of his love for easy praise and how it had made him weak. He told them about the river woman who taught him to work. The crowd listened and some wiped their eyes. Linda stood proud at his side, not as a trophy but as the woman who had sown hope into the household. At the end of the night an old woman stepped forward and placed a calabash on the ground. She said the proverb everyone now used, "When laziness marries greed, their first child is shame." But she did not stop there. She added a final line, "But when shame meets honest hands, it may become wisdom." The people sang and drank from the calabash. Junior danced like a light flame. Frank felt something like peace move through his ribs. He had lost much, but he had gained a small larger thing, the chance to be counted among the honest again. Frank and Linda opened a small joint business, a place where Linda sewed and Frank made small wooden stools and tables. They called it Work and Thread. The sign was not loud. It did not promise riches in days. It promised honest work and fair trade. People came because Linda's stitch was good and because Frank's wooden stools were steady. The business did not make them rich quickly, but it made them slow and strong. Junior would sit on the stool and sell small pastries to the children and learn how to keep coins in a small book. The compound supported them because they had given back trust and had built a new promise. Work and Thread became a place where young men came to learn the small trades and where old women could sell food. Samuel helped by giving a small shed for tools. Mama Jacob sold frozen fish at the same stall, and Mrs. Okoro brought cloth to resell. The community had created a small market of trust that kept people from falling for glossy men. Their sign became a small refuge for people who wanted to learn to make things and to keep promises. The name CEO faded like old paint. In its place grew a pattern of hands working side by side. Junior saved money from small sales and used it to buy a pen and some books. His teacher noticed how he had become quiet, thoughtful, and asked what changed him. Junior spoke of his father and how he had learned that work matters. The teacher smiled and said, "Your father found his path." The boy felt proud not because of a title, but because his hands could now make a small bench and his mother's sewing could dress other children. He had a new kind of wealth that did not show on a phone screen. At school, he told a story of a man who once wanted quick riches. The story ended with the line his mother had taught him, "Trust is a river, do not throw stones." His classmates listened and the story spread. It became a small lesson at the market and later at other compounds. The boy had grown into something quiet and true. He would not become his father's mirror, but the child who could fix it. The city trickster returned once more, but this time he came with lawyers and bright words. He tried to set up a new scheme that would promise jobs but only steal sweat. The compound had learned patience and the elders called him out. Frank and Samuel worked with the community to make a small cooperative that could test city offers before anyone gave money. The lawyers frowned when faced with a group that asked the right questions. The trickster left with his bright words and a disappointed face. The compound had become wise, and wisdom can be heavier than a man's tongue. The cooperative became a place where people could apply for small loans and be taught how to use them. It taught how to save and how to make plans that could be measured. The glossy card that had once tempted them was now nailed on a board as a museum piece of a lesson learned. Frank and Linda taught classes at the cooperative, and children came to learn small trades. The little place made mistakes but learned faster the second time. People began to trust again, not blindly but with the eyes that had learned to look. 1 year after the collapse, Mama Jacob's freezer hummed louder than before. It held fish and small meat that was salted and wrapped. Her business had grown, and she could help a neighbor when rain made a roof leak. She told the story of the time the compound nearly fell and how they saved themselves by choosing slow work. The Isusa box had more names and more coins. The people who had once given and lost had found ways to rebuild their small boats and row them steadily. Frank's name was no longer whispered in mockery. People called him a man who had found the long road. He still owed money to Samuel, and Samuel still said, "Pay the debt one day at a time." But when Frank looked at Linda and at Junior and at the children who learned at Work and Thread, he felt a gratitude bigger than his old dreams. He learned that a true dream is not a short song on a screen, but the slow making of a life that can hold others. On a last evening, Frank returned to the river. The moon spread like a cut coin. He sat by the stones and told the woman in his dreams of the work he had done and of the men in the compound who had chosen to stay. The water listened. He took a small coin and threw it into the river with his eyes closed. He asked only one thing, that he would never again chase quick ghosts and that he would teach Junior to work. The river took the coin and seemed to say something like a small wind. He walked back to the compound hand in hand with Linda. Junior ran ahead and called to them like a small prophet. Mr. Johnson sat under the neem tree and smiled. Samuel nodded and said, "You paid more than money." Frank looked up and said nothing because words were small now. He had learned that living with truth is better than living with big lies. The compound felt like a heart that had found its beat again. They tell the story of Frank and the Isusu in the market again and again. It is not a tale to shame only. It is a tale about a man who ate a quick dream and learned the taste of work. Mothers tell it to boys who dream of easy money and to girls who hear the shiny words of glossy men. The song ends with a proverb that everyone now says like a prayer. When laziness marries greed, their first child is shame. But when shame meets honest hands, it may become wisdom. Junior grows in that story, and someday will teach another child how to count coins and how to keep promises. This tale is not finished in an instant. It keeps going in the hands that make things and in the people who choose to slow down and build. Kingsley Close is quieter now in the mornings and alive in the afternoons. The plastic chair that once held a man of many promises sits empty sometimes, but it waits for those who will sit and learn the slow ways. The Isuzu box hums, and the freezer in Mama Jacob's stall keeps the fish cold. And when a new shiny voice comes whispering fast riches, a woman will say, "Remember the river," and the children will look and learn. The compound will teach its children the truth, work, honesty, and the slow making of trust.